The Humvee's brakes squealed as the driver downshifted to take a sharp right. Then we came to a stop. "All right, gents, you know the drill," Sergeant Stafford yelled out. This was the 19th house search we'd had today, and quite frankly, we were all getting sick of it. My boots hit the sand, and I slung my rifle over, getting a good grip on it. An exhalation of exhaustion and boredom was heard from all the guys as we approached the door. "You think we'll catch this one red-handed, Ellis?" Ray grinned at me. "Oh yeah, pants around his ankles and all. God, I felt embarrassed for that guy." We stacked up for our routine formation at the door. Corporal Martinez approached the front, lowering his rifle. He took a quick charge up and punted the door wide open. "Move, move, move!" I swung around the right corner, scanning the area, and I had Ray on my rear checking the front. It was a kitchen area. Busted cupboards, disgusting-looking tiles. The whole place reeked of old carpet and mold. I felt Ray's hand on my rig, indicating for me to press on. I rushed forward in a controlled manner and felt the 6 pairs of footsteps trailing behind me. The living room was clear, and we headed for the stairs, located at the far left. I heard some rummaging upstairs, so I indicated to Sergeant Stafford in the rear to swap me out. I quickly rushed along the right side of the column, swapping with Private Ashford, who carried the team's big-ass shotgun. Ashford excitedly raised his weapon, waiting for the tap. I was now in the 4th position, carefully threading into the stack. My eyes were constantly darting left and right, looking for the open back door or window or what have you. We started moving up the stairs, hugging the wall tightly. Reaching the turn in the staircase, Ashford confidently swung the corner. Having a little visibility over Mendez's shoulder, I saw him freeze. His face turned pale in a matter of seconds, the clacking of his rifle sling indicating his violent shaking. Ashford moved to the fore, 6 shots fired in the direction of something upstairs. Contact! Private Watford swung around Ashford to provide greater suppression fire and move up the stairs to unclog the stack. An ear-piercing sound came from upstairs, the chaos ensuring the formation was disoriented, along with the noise, and I began to feel nauseous. Grabbing Martinez's collar, I tugged him down the stairs to free the staircase for engagement. As we were moving down the stairs, I caught a glimpse of what appeared to be a woman, entirely covered in bullet holes, dashing towards Ashford. Click, click, click. His gun ran dry, and it was already too late. The hellish creature, dripping blood and having a few pieces of meat barely holding its limbs together, closed the distance between him and snapped his neck with an inhuman amount of force. A magazine dumped by Watford led him to the same fate. Having it turned towards us, I caught some details of what it looked like. Its face was hollow, cheeks sunken in, eye sockets empty. Saying it was pale would be an understatement. Freakishly skinny and tall, completely destroyed by bullet holes. Its nails were probably the size of half a knife. Our whimpers and curses were muffled by the sound of the automatic fire and ejecting magazines. It was not phased. "Get down!" The familiar sound of a grenade being ejected from the grenade launcher tube echoed from behind me. I dove to the left, managing to pull Martinez down just in time, and an explosion followed. Then it was just darkness. My ears were ringing, face full of dust. Aching pain in my left leg stuck as I attempted to get up. I slowly opened my eyes, glaring at the flickering light from the ceiling. I glanced to my right, but Martinez wasn't there. That's when I spotted all the bodies. Sergeant Stafford, Corporal Smith, PFC Erutious. I whimpered in fear as I dragged my ass towards the wall, breathing heavily. I felt my rifle under my right hand and gripped it tight. Another detailed look towards the deceased, and I spotted Martinez too. Hunched over on a chair, head hung backwards, throat slashed open. Ray. I didn't see Ray anywhere. I had to find him. I pulled myself up, nearly collapsing. A quick glance down towards my knee revealed the issue. A huge piece of debris had lodged itself in there. I pulled it out, letting out a groan and a few quick breaths. Dragging that leg behind and pushing myself off the wall, I started moving upstairs. "Ray! Where are you, man?" I turned the corner of the stairs and realized why Ashford froze. The upstairs area was a large living room. In there, neatly arranged, were about 14 to 15 chairs. Sitting in them with perfect posture were corpses. The corpses of recon squads that went missing earlier today. In the farthest chair to the right, I spotted Ray. He was alive. I started making my way up the stairs, and I saw his eyes widen and his lips attempt to say something. "I'm coming, man. Just hold on." "Ellis, on the ceiling." My blood ran cold and my eyes widened. In a split second, my heart rate doubled, and I was clenching my jaw so hard I could have easily broken it. Slowly, raising my glance and rifle towards the ceiling, I saw it. Head slightly tilted to the right, hanging onto the ceiling with those ridiculously long legs. Its thinning hair hung down, drenched in blood, inches from my face. It let out a sickening gurgle or a groan before striking at me. I woke up in one of those chairs. I glanced to my left and noticed Ray wasn't there. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream echoed from the next room. I dove out the window and crawled away, giving it a quick glance backwards. It was staring at me, its hollow face replicating what would have been a smile on a human. Its arms moved up, raising something. I caught a glance of a familiar blonde head. "Ray, I'm so sorry, man." I hadn't seen Mike in a few months. He'd been buried in work, and our usual weekend nights out had all but disappeared. Then he called me on a Thursday and invited me over for drinks. I jumped at the invite, but I took note of how depressed he sounded on the phone. By the time I got there, Mike had already started drinking and was slurring his words pretty badly. A dark cloud seemed to hover over him, which got worse when he drank. I finally asked what had been going on with him, and Mike turned even darker. Afraid, he said it had to do with work. I never really knew what Mike did for a living. I did know that he worked for the city in the tech department, and was involved in the CCTV surveillance network. But I never knew what his day-to-day was like, which he began to describe in detail. Mike explained that there were thousands of cameras scattered throughout the downtown area, the outlying neighborhoods, as well as in the suburbs of our million-plus people city. His responsibility was to categorize and archive all the incoming footage. Most of the footage went into a very general classification and was saved to a hard drive and identified with a lengthy combination of numbers and letters for categorically archiving them. They were truly meant to be forgotten about. It was a pretty expansive task, but Mike had designed and built an AI screening program that detected common patterns in footage, which selected out anomalous behaviors for later scrutiny. He said the vast majority wasn't even noteworthy. Something like 99.9% was just trash. Then, of course, there was the 0.1%. The car accidents, the assaults, the swarmings, the abductions, the murders, those went into a special archive for use in criminal investigations. And then there was the even more exclusive 0.001%. These were held in a classification archive that contained footage of captured events that were, from all accounts, unexplainable. This was called the Tartarus Archive. I looked up the word Tartarus after and discovered that it was one of the darkest, deepest prisons in Greek mythology. It was said that if you dropped an anvil from heaven, it would take 7 days for it to reach the earth. It would take another 7 days for the anvil to reach Tartarus. It was the place they had put the Titans when they had found that nowhere else could contain them. As it turned out, the name was quite fitting for the archives. Some of the footage could be simplified to strange optical anomalies in the camera, and coincidences of light, or a crackhead on a bender going through the subway system. Other footage defied logic. The others are what captured Mike's mind that evening. He'd been breaking protocol and bringing hard drives home at night. In fact, he'd been splicing the footage together, capturing and compiling repeat aberrations, and editing them into a linear sequence. Mike wanted to show me some. It wasn't in a bragging or showing off kind of way either. It felt more like the sharing of a heavy burden. I asked if showing me would get him in trouble, but he waved the idea away. I said, yeah, obviously I want to see what's going on in the city. Mike led me into his workroom. There was a monitor and a tower and a pile of externals set up. We sat down and he skimmed through some drives nervously. Then he landed on one. Mike told me this anomaly was codenamed Lincoln Spectre. He pressed play. On the large screen, black and white footage started up, showing me Lincoln Avenue, one of our less active downtown streets, at 3 a.m. The camera angle showed me the length of Lincoln Avenue as it led into the downtown core. The street appeared to be empty and quiet. From a side road, a woman emerged, walking towards the camera. As she approached the intersection, she turned over her shoulder and appeared to scream. The woman took off, spreading past the camera, which cut to a new, wide angle from another camera across the street. We watched the woman running frantically, seeming to be chased, but she was the only one on the street. There was no one else anywhere near her. The woman kept screaming as she ran, and the camera kept following, cutting between different CCTV angles. We watched as the woman was chased in the middle of an empty intersection. She fell then, cowering as if something massive was standing over her. The woman's neck stiffened, and she began to levitate off the ground suddenly. Her body looked like a rag doll as something lifted her by the throat until she was floating a dozen feet above the road, in the middle of the intersection. Then the woman's head snapped to the left, and her body fell back to the ground. The video ended and went black. I was shocked. Mike saw my expression and said, "You ain't seen nothing yet." I asked if what I had seen was real, if that was unaltered raw footage. And Mike said that all he had done was put the clips together. Hell, none of the content had been touched. He told me the accident ended up being written up as a hit and run, and the case was left figuratively open for more evidence to amass, which it never would. The department kept footage hidden, claiming it was a camera malfunction. No one outside of Mike and his boss had seen the video, and how the poor woman had actually died. I started to understand the air of sombrance Mike was carrying around. Mike started the next video. This one was codenamed Black Crab, and was much longer than the previous one. It started in the subway system, at the underground Walkley station, shortly after closing up for the night. Walkley was the last stop on the route, and the exterior was shouldered by a new housing development on one side, and an untouched forest and swampland on the other. The camera was pointed down along the subway platform on the east side, and it showed its entire length with benches and garbage cans populating it. At the far end of the tunnel, there was only darkness. The lights on the platform shut off, and the station went black. The camera switched to night vision, and everything became more visible. My eyes trained on the platform, waiting for something to happen. Finally, there was movement. It was coming from the tunnel. It was difficult to identify what exactly it was at first, since the movements were strange and the footage was grainy. But it got closer to the camera, and I got a better look. It resembled a human, a man, but he was walking on his hands and feet, upside down, with his back arched and his stomach pointing to the ceiling. He had long dark hair that dragged along the ground, and he wore the tattered layers of an old jacket and torn pants. He moved like a crab, jerkily yet quickly, and despite his posture, he made his way easily up the stairs. The footage cut to a new camera in the dark hallway leading to the stairs out of the station. We watched the crab walker claw up 2 steps at a time, and then crawl over the turnstile and towards the exit. The footage cut again, now showing the exterior of the train station. The crab walker squeezed and twisted and maneuvered his body through the locked and closed entrance. It looked impossible to accomplish, but he managed it. Once outside, the crab walker eyed his surroundings before skittering off towards the woods and disappearing. The footage cut to an hour later and revealed the crab walker reappearing from the woods. He was dragging a small animal by the tail in his teeth. It looked like a cat. The crab walker squeezed back through the gate, crawled through the station, and disappeared into the tunnel again. Mike saw my expression and told me that there was more. He showed me the length of the video, which was over an hour. Mike had compiled over 20 sequences of the crab walker creeping out of the subway station and into the woods. Mike skimmed through the videos towards the end, and we watched the crab walker coming out of a sewer in the downtown alleyway. It crawled over to a pile of garbage bags and cardboard boxes. Then it jumped onto them, and some kind of vicious frenzy ensued. There was someone else in the pile of garbage. Hands and feet thrashed about as they were struggling for their life. Then the movement stopped, and the hands and feet went still. The crab walker's body moved jerkily about, but I couldn't see what was happening because of the darkness and all the garbage bags and boxes obscuring the camera view. Mike leaned over to me and whispered that the crab walker was eating a homeless man. This caused a criminal investigation as the dead body was found mutilated and festering in the open alleyway. Mike followed up on the inquiry. What he discovered was the crab walker who authorities believed to be a man named David Fletcher. Decades ago, David had been a prominent lawyer with a family. One Christmas, there was a huge fire, and his wife and kids were killed in the blaze. It was David's fault. He had lost everything, including his mind, it seemed. Everyone has a breaking point, whether they know it or not. A place where they've been too far and then snap. David had apparently found his. Family and friends described his descent as nightmarish. David lived on the street, becoming addicted to drugs and tumbling into mental illness. The last anyone knew of him was from 10 years prior. He'd thrown himself in front of a subway at the Walkie station, and no one had heard from him since. It appeared that somehow David had survived the subway hit. His back had broken and healed oddly, causing him to move the way he did. He'd adapted to the new posture and lived in the darkness of the subway for years, finding sustenance from drain water and wild animals that he caught. That was what Mike found out, at least, but then he said that was just the answer the investigators gave at Discovery. Who knew where the truth actually lay? Mike said there was always an answer for the videos he found. Whether the answers were true or not, no one knew. But the ones that had become public all needed explanations, however absurd. Either way, David was never found and didn't reappear on the subway footage. Mike plugged in a new hard drive. He poured a fresh drink and told me this was the one that had troubled him. The file was codenamed Cloud Mirror. I wasn't honestly sure I wanted to see it, but before I could object, Mike had pressed play. All the monitors lit up with footage from different intersections downtown on the exact date and time of each other. There were 5 in total. The streets on each of the screens were empty and quiet. No cars, no people. Suddenly, at the exact time in the center of the intersection, a small glow pulsed into existence. It was some kind of orb, roughly the size of a bowling ball. The streetlights around it pulsed with energy waves as the orb grew larger. It grew to the size of a beach ball, then it flashed out. The streetlights went back to normal, and the intersection was as lifeless as it had been before. I asked Mike what had happened. He told me he had gigs of footage of the orb and had watched them repeatedly. He didn't know what they were. At first, they had just started by chance. Mike clicked on the next video, and again 5 monitors lit up with the strange intersection and time of night. But it was several weeks later. The streetlights glowed and pulsed, and an orb manifested into existence again. It grew to its beach ball size, but then it altered the surface. Something gas-like replaced it, growing outward into a couch-sized cloud of deep gray. One of the cameras was closer, so I got to see the small cloud in detail. It looked like a volcanic eruption wrapping around itself. They were large, constantly morphing blobs that curled around from the glowing center, resembling a mandelbulb fractal as a gaseous-based organism. It was fascinating to see them floating in the middle of the street, so alien to our roads and stoplights and street lamps. Then they began to move. Gliding down empty roads, the cameras cut to different angles, following the clouds on some unknown paths, zigging and zagging into new streets and through alleyways. Then they stopped. The clouds hovered in the center of the intersection. They lowered to ground level, standing straight up like a large coffin. Holding rigid to their shapes, their exteriors continued to shift and mold together like magnets made of smoke. Something on one of the monitors caught my eye. Down the street, people appeared. They'd seen the clouds and were walking towards it. The group looked drunk and fascinated by the floating entities, so much so that they approached it. As they did, the clouds became brighter. The street lamps began to pulse. The group were in some kind of a trance, staring into the morphic blob. One of the group, a guy, stared into it like a zombie, then walked right into the cloud and disappeared. None of the group tried to stop him. Instead, another one followed him in, and another, and another. All 5 members of the group disappeared into the cloud. Then they reappeared, one at a time. The first guy, and then in the order they came in. Only they weren't stumbling or boisterous or drunk now. They were walking upright, using minimal movements. They formed into a perfect 5-person circle for several seconds after quick words, then turned and all went in separate directions. Their strides and arm swings were all sped up to match. Another monitor showed a similar situation with a large group of people, lost in revelry as they marched one after another into the cloud. Each monitor showed the same thing, people entering the clouds and coming back out different. Mike stopped the video. I asked him if he'd shown this to anyone. He said he hadn't, not even to his boss, which was a problem because he had a meeting with his boss in the morning to discuss the missing footage. I asked why he didn't show the footage to his boss. This footage seemed more serious. People were being replaced by something. Mike sighed and put a new video on. The main monitor lit up and showed a new downtown street. The date was from earlier this week, and one of the clouds was floating in the intersection. A middle-aged couple was walking nearby, the husband with a slight limp on his right leg. The couple saw the clouds and were sucked in by their aura. They approached it, eyes wide and mouths open. Both husband and wife entered the cloud and disappeared. After a moment, they reappeared and the husband's limp was magically gone. Mike turned to me and said, "That was my boss and his wife." It was the 5th year. The 5th freaking year. Every summer since I moved into this place, I've always made an attempt to grow a garden. The thoughts of picking fresh vegetables out of my own yard brought me back to my childhood. In my opinion, they always taste better grown that way. On top of that, it seemed like every single person in the neighborhood had their own lush garden. I could go down a list of reasons why I wanted to grow one. For whatever reason I might use, I believed the work needed to prepare the soil, plant the seeds, and tend to water and weed was well worth it. I want to make this known so you'll understand my frustration when I tell you that I've not harvested a single vegetable from my garden. I do everything right. All the plants are in the perfect place for sunlight. I always make sure they have enough water. What doesn't make any sense is that the plants themselves grow just fine. They grow tall and healthy, showing their beautiful green colors to the neighborhood. I've switched it up plenty of times through the years. I've tried to grow corn, cucumbers, zucchini, radishes, tomatoes, peppers of every kind you can imagine. None of them bore a single thing the whole time they grew. This was the one thing I wanted, ever since I could even contemplate the possibility of owning my own house. I had dreams of growing my very own garden. Well, I finally snapped. It was Halloween. Summer was over, and the weather was turning sour by the day. I had just gotten home from a long day at work. Sitting on my porch was a bowl of Kit Kats for the early trick-or-treaters. Enjoying the sunset as I read a book, I began to think about the failures in my garden. I was becoming stressed out and frustrated at the mere thought of it. I set my book down and went into my garden to get a shovel, angrily marching over to my dying garden. If you're not going to grow me anything, I might as well dig you up and start over, I thought. The thought came over me as I plunged the shovel into the dirt. I almost said it out loud, as if the garden could hear me or something. I put more emotion behind each thrust, putting in more momentum and driving my foot with all the force I could muster, digging deeper as I went. As I kept going, I lost myself in anger, but after a few minutes of this, I realized I couldn't believe I was taking out my anger on my garden. It was only a garden. I slowed down. I was about to stop before my shovel hit something solid. I heard a thump of impact. It wasn't a rock. I jabbed the shovel twice more and heard the same thump-thump both times. Interested, I dug around and scooped out some dirt with my hand, ripping apart networks of small roots to reveal a wooden plank. It didn't appear to be on its own, more like part of a large structure, a box or something. My emotional state turned from anger to excitement. Maybe I hadn't been able to grow a garden in the yard, but I might have just found someone's hidden treasure. I dug even faster in my excited state. Now that my anger was gone, I flung dirt all over, not even remaining attentive enough to keep nice, neat piles. I furiously worked to uncover the surface of the box and found its edges. The thought about what could be inside rattled around in my mind. The worst part was cutting through all the roots to get to the thing. I had a hard time pulling most of them out with my hands, having to use the shovel to chop at them first. Then I took a step back, getting the whole picture. I immediately noticed its shape. It was that of a casket. It was an old one, or at least a makeshift wooden one. I stared at it in disbelief. This house wasn't that old. Why would there be a casket in the yard? It didn't seem possible at the moment. I shrugged the shape off as just being an odd one. I chopped at the roots that crawled around the edges, finishing them off. Reaching down slowly, I gripped the side of the casket and flipped it open. A set of empty eye sockets looked back at me, though what remained of the casket was far from a skeleton. Beside the skull, the rest of the naked body still had plenty of flesh remaining. Too much flesh. The corpse had the musculature of a bodybuilder, more definition than I'd ever seen on a living person. Its organs were visible, barely contained by the muscle tissue around them. Everything about the supposed corpse, besides the head, looked like it was still alive, but the shape of the bone structure seemed inhuman. Its veins were shown clearly through the entire body, and it lacked skin. Each one was connected to roots that crawled around its entire body, roots that filled the rest of the space in the coffin. I knelt just to get a closer look, but I started to hear something. I leaned in further, almost touching this grotesque corpse. I stopped my breathing to listen. The rhythmic beat of a heart filled my ears. I gasped, jerking myself up and stepping back. I felt my own heart beat faster and faster as it rose in my chest, and I found myself breathing rapidly in fright. I ran inside and grabbed the phone, my fingers dialing 911. 911, what's your emergency? I found a casket with a body in it in my yard, but there's something wrong with it. I proceeded to give the operator my location, and she assured me that the police were en route, only minutes away. After the call ended, I ran outside again to my freshly dug up garden. I was stopped dead in my tracks. My eyes felt like they were about to burst from my skull as I looked before me to see the casket with no corpse. All that remained were the roots, still mended by the body they had been strung across, surrounding what was now only space in an empty casket. It was gone. I looked up, my eyes darting around, spinning my head in all directions. A chill crawled up my spine, and I tensed up as I searched for the corpse. It was nowhere to be seen. The cops pulled up to my house a few minutes later, and 2 officers stepped out of their vehicle. I saw them but paid little attention, still scanning around. You the one who called it in? Well, yeah, I did, but it's not here. When you called, you said there was a dead body, correct? I did, yeah, but it's not here. See? I pointed to the hole in my garden. The officers approached, but stopped at the edge, both leaning in to get a peek. They displayed confused expressions. The other officer, who had yet to say anything, let out a single chuckle, as if he found this ridiculous, before shaking his head and turning the other way. The other sighed and looked towards me. Are you aware it's illegal to abuse the use of 911? I don't abuse anything, sir. There was a body here just a few minutes ago. I don't know. You don't know what? What happened to it? You thought it would be cute to set up a little casket, Halloween decoration style, and report a dead body to us. You dig it up now to make a little display just for us? No, well, yeah, I just dug it up, but This made me think of something. I looked back at the hole, realizing my shovel was nowhere to be seen. Something hit my back. Felt like a droplet of water from a sprinkler. A scream followed from one of the officers. Turning back, I made eye contact with the cold, dead eyes of the first officer and the tip of the shovel that ran through the head, splitting it apart. The shovel was ripped from the back of his skull, and his body fell, head landing at my feet. I was now once again looking at the empty eye sockets of the corpse that had been under my garden. I turned towards the other officer who had drawn his gun. The sound of the first shot shocked me so much, I fell to the ground. The officer popped off bullet after bullet as he retreated to his car, each one connecting with the muscles on the body. The corpse didn't so much twitch in reaction. It kept its slow, steady pace, walking towards the officer. The officer paused, taking a moment to make a well-placed shot. It grazed the top of the corpse's skull and took a chunk with it. This seemed to anger it. In one swift, lightning-quick motion, it raised the shovel and threw it like a javelin, gliding through the officer before bursting through the windshield of the patrol car, pinning him to it. While this happened, I had enough time to draw the gun out of the other officer's holster, By the time I had it, I looked up to see the empty eye sockets of the corpse looking back at me. I booked it to my front door, but by my account, it didn't have any interest in a chase. As soon as I was inside, I slammed the door shut and locked it, grabbing my phone and heading for the kitchen, which had the back door to the house. I dialed 911 again, checking the chamber for a round while the phone rang. 911, what's your emergency? Yeah, I just called a little while ago. Your officers were just murdered right before my eyes. The thing that killed them is outside my house right now. It killed them with a shovel. With a shovel! I screamed into the phone as I kept the gun raised in the direction of the entryway. You need backup. Lots and lots of backup. Please, get here soon. It's... A boom echoed through the house. I trembled at the sudden noise, raising the gun in my shaking hands that held it. The front door creaked open, and footsteps followed. They only took a few steps inside before they stopped. It's been a long, long time. It could talk. I didn't expect that. I tried to reason with it. What do you want? It seemed to ignore me. All this time, dreaming of this day, the day I would rise and feast on the world once again. Oh, it feels good. I don't want to go back. I began to shake even harder, looking over at my back door, ready to make a run for it any second. Of course, I have you to thank for all this. I looked back to see the corpse staring at me from across the hall. I just needed the fuel, and if it weren't for you, I wouldn't have gotten it. You feeding me all those years, preparing me for this day. Oh, come on, boy. Haven't you always wanted your own little garden? Here I am. The flesh that bound the bottom jaw to the top retracted back. It was smiling at me. I felt dazed, like I was about to throw up. It turned its head back to the front door. Sirens began to approach from the distance. It could tell. It knew they were coming. I took the opportunity, swinging the door open and sprinting through the backyard and the first row of trees that separated me from the neighbors. I ran faster than I could think. Through backyard after backyard, I sprinted. Gunfire erupted from behind me, but I kept going. It sounded as if a war had broken out, and a battle was taking place in my neighborhood. Soon I emerged into the next street, but I kept running. I forgot all about the handgun I was holding. A kid in a Jedi costume noticed, dropping his plastic lightsaber and plastic pumpkin full of candy, screaming as he ran away from me. The dozen or so other kids and some of the adults who accompanied them on the street noticed it too. They screamed and ran as well. I thought about saying something, but I didn't bother. Being scared and on the move was probably for their own good. They didn't know what was behind me. A man emerged from a house in front of me with a shotgun and aimed it at my head. Stop right there. I did as he said, aware of the situation that I seemed to have created. I raised my right hand with the gun above my head and did the same with my left, showing him my empty palm. Listen, something's coming. I didn't shoot anyone, I swear. We gotta get out of here, or stop it, or... What in the hell are you doing, waving a gun around, scaring all these kids out trick-or-treating? Drop the gun right now. Not wanting to get a face full of buckshot in the street, I dropped the handgun and kept my hands raised. The man turned back inside his house, and I could faintly hear him tell somebody to call the police. He turned back towards me, adjusting his aim. Something caught his attention, and he looked slightly to the left before something collided with his face and knocked him to the ground. It exploded on impact and spewed an orange substance everywhere. It was a pumpkin. I looked to my right to see the corpse walking towards me. It was bleeding profusely and had many obvious holes ripped in its tissue and an even larger chunk torn out of its skull. In one hand it held a jack-o'-lantern. With the other, it pointed at me. I'm not finished with you yet. It yelled to me. I glanced down. The gun was only a leaping distance away. It seemed like my only choice. I dove, but something hit me before I could make it. It threw the other pumpkin. It fell apart when it hit me, pieces of its shell flying around. I fell on my back and began to gasp for air. It had knocked the wind out of me, and I could tell at least a few ribs had been broken. I felt achy all over my body. It even hurt my neck, and I turned to look at the corpse as it approached me. A gunshot rang through the air, and the corpse stumbled back. It recovered and rose, only to be shot again, this time tripping and falling to the ground. I flipped myself over and began to push myself from the ground. It took 2 attempts to get myself up. I looked up to see a woman on the porch, holding the shotgun the man had been aiming at me. I then looked back down and locked eyes on the handgun. I picked it up as I stumbled back to my feet. I was still shaking and in pain. It limited my ability to hold the sight straight, and I knew I couldn't be very accurate, but I wasn't far from my target. I shot rapidly, some bullets making contact, some just hitting the ground. Behind me, the woman continued to blast the corpse with the shotgun. I was empty, and with her last shell, she shattered the skull to pieces. Its black brains spattered out and painted the pavement. The corpse wasn't moving anymore. I retreated to the porch of the house next to the one with the woman holding the shotgun, keeping my empty gun trained on the now lifeless corpse. More sirens were approaching. After a few minutes, I sat on the stairs and lowered my gun, setting it on the step beside me. I dearly hoped it was finally over. An armored police truck pulled up onto the street we were on, and followed by a caravan of all sorts of emergency vehicles. Ambulances, fire trucks, and even police from some of the other towns around ours. Some stopped on our street, some moved on to my street. The police that stepped out of the armored truck were equipped with heavy body armor and rifles. They surrounded the corpse in the street. The woman on the porch screamed for the paramedics. A few of them ran to her and her husband lying on the ground. I heard the woman cry out in relief and thank them over and over again when one of them said that her husband was going to be all right. I got up and limped my way over to them. I talked with the paramedics for a while and let them know how injured I was. "You're going to have to wait. There are others with more life-threatening injuries, and we need to attend to them." I didn't respond, except for nodding my head. I overheard someone else in the crowd, at first responders, say, "We got 7 dead officers and a dozen dead civilians, with twice that many injured. We don't know how the hell this happened." Hearing this, I lowered myself to the curb, sitting down gently to not hurt myself worse. I watched the woman walk with the paramedics as they carried her husband on a stretcher into the ambulance. She waited outside as they shut the door. She watched the ambulance leave before taking a seat next to me on the curb. I tried to muster something to say, failing horribly. I wanted to apologize to her for what had happened to her husband, but I didn't know what to say. Sorry I dug up that monster in my yard. I didn't think anyone, including myself, was ready to process that. Looking at the side of their house, I opted for a different topic of conversation. "That's a lovely garden you have." She laughed, looking over at it like I was. She paused for a moment and let out a sigh. "Yeah, it might look lovely, but I don't know what's wrong with it. Ever since we moved into this place, the plants we grow have never given us anything. We haven't gotten a single vegetable. Must be something in the dirt." The last thought I had before drifting to sleep was how excited I was to finally be going on a proper road trip. I've driven for a few hours here and there for vacation. I've even taken a decent 10-plus hour trip, but never truly had a road trip. Me and my wife are driving from the Midwest, all the way to sunny California. I've spent some time there in my youth and always wanted to go back. Enjoy the beauty and the weirdness of the Venice Beach, eat a Dodger dog at Chavez Ravine, take a normie Hollywood Stars double-decker bus tour across Beverly Hills. We're going to travel to NorCal, too. See the Golden Gate, see that crooked road, and of course see the house where the Tanners lived. Rest in peace, Danny Tanner. No Rain by the Blind Melons started playing on one of those serious 90s channels. "Oh, wow, I love this song," my wife blurted out. I, of course, knew that already. "And we caught it when it started," she said. This again, I also knew. She's not superstitious at all, the least superstitious person I've ever known. But she has this one thing. If no rain comes on when she's flipping channels, or in the middle of a TV commercial or something, she cannot listen to it. It must start at the beginning where it's bad luck. Hey, we all have our thing, right? Seeing how happy she was, I drifted off. Enjoy your prize, hun. I'm gonna nod off for a few. She barely acknowledged me, which was fine. I was happy she was happy. My eyelids stayed closed, like a curtain after a successful Broadway show. When I awoke several hours later, I wiped the sleep from my eyes. I always pictured that childlike way of making little fists and rubbing my eyes, but I did it the adult way, just full-on rubbing my face with my open palms. I thought I had been out for about an hour. It was nearing dusk when I drifted off. I knew we were in the area of Missouri or Kansas, boring flat land. The pinkish-red sky was calming, soothing somehow, but when I woke up the sky was cloudless and bright blue, a blue I'd never seen before. I didn't feel like I'd slept through the night. Groggily, I took in my surroundings. Still driving, the wife was at the wheel. "Oh my goodness, I adore this song," she said. Blind Melon was on the radio. I know," I stated. "How did this song start again? Did I just happen to wake up when this song randomly started playing again, hours later?" A tiny, uncomfortable pit the size of a walnut appeared in my stomach, just behind my belly button. Things were about to become serious. "What time is it?" I asked. She slid eyes to me, not wanting to take her focus off the road. "It's 7 o'clock, hon. You were only out for a few minutes." Confused, but chalking it up to that confusion of the heavy power nap, I looked out my window at the endless plains. I saw mountains, though. Mountains made of metal. No, that can't be right. I can only describe them as shiny metallic. What year is it? She furrowed her brow and snorted. "It's 2025, babe. Same year it was when we started this trip about a dozen hours ago." Now I was rigid. That's not right. We started the trip 3 years before, in the current year of 2022. I decided not to say anything. I didn't know what to say. That little walnut pit in my stomach grew to a watermelon. She gave me a playful push on the shoulder and continued to sing Blind Melon. She then looked over at me, giving me a little smile with her tongue out. She'd done this particular gesture thousands of times during our relationship. Her eyes were piercing blue. The problem was, her eyes are hazel. They were always hazel. Or were hazel, I suppose. "What happened to your eyes? Are you okay? Do you need me to drive?" I must have had a panicked expression that I did not intend to portray. She looked instantly worried. "I'm fine, hon. Are you okay? Maybe you had too many Slim Jims or something." She laughed. As she finished singing the song, the DJ came on. That was 1979's #1 hit, "No Rain" by Blind Melon. What a voice of a generation. Shannon Hoon, still kicking after all these years. We have an exclusive interview with the man who produced so many hits and famously joined the Beatles a few years later, replacing John Lennon, who left for, well, we all know the reason. Stay tuned, folks. In the meantime, enjoy the brand new Weezer hit. I think the band is going to be huge. What the hell was this? Shannon Hoon died of an overdose in '95, and he certainly never joined the most famous band in the world. "We're at our first stop," my wife said, breaking me from the mental panic. Our Jeep rumbled to a stop. I saw the black motel in front of me. "What is this?" I said. "It's where we're going to sleep for the first night on our road trip, silly. Don't pretend you're not excited to finally stay here." I pretended to know what the hell she was talking about, and said something to affirm that. This place was horrendous. It was foreboding and smelled like bad cheese. I took our bags out, all the while keeping focus on the front of this castle. It reminded me of Skeletor's fortress from He-Man. The inside was surprisingly nice. Looked like any Holiday Inn across the United States. After a few drinks that we brought from 2022, I hope, we did some married things, and then decided to order takeout and see what was on the hotel TV. She said she was pretty beat after driving all day and wanted to take a quick nap. I thought that was a great idea. That will give me some time to go online and see where the hell I was or what time I was in. I stood at the elevator, pushing the down button. What looked like a father and a daughter trotted from one of the hallways, stopping near me. I turned to acknowledge them with a polite smile and a head nod. Upset doesn't really begin to describe how I felt when I looked at them. They looked like humans, but just off a bit. The eyes were too wide, the nose was too small, the ears were almost non-existent. When the elevator opened, they entered, and I froze. The father held his arm out in front of the door to save it for me. I fished for my phone and pretended to take a call. I politely gave him that, "Thanks, but I have to go. Over here, look." He shrugged and let the door close. At that moment, I noticed my heart was pumping through my chest. It was only then that that same heart almost broke through my ribcage. I noticed the phone I had in my hand was a 2000s era flip phone, not even a razor. I looked at it like it was a medieval device. I slowly pulled the antenna out, and I opened it and closed it. I studied the drab gray. I stared at the abysmal display screen. What year was it? I burst through the stairwell and made my way down to the lobby. Our floor was only on the second floor, so I wasn't totally out of breath. But I did, however, throw up when I got outside. The only time, mind you, that I'd thrown up without being drunk or actually sick. Luckily, I've never been a puker. I slowly and cautiously entered our room, with a key card, just like 2022. My wife was thankfully asleep. I needed to go sit down. I was nauseous, and my stomach felt like two grizzly bears were trying to tear it apart from opposite sides. I decided to step back outside, just to make sure my wife got complete silence for a bit longer. I slumped down in the hallway outside our door. Let's go over what happened. I took a road trip nap. When I woke up, 3 years had passed. Little things have changed, but they were huge. The blind melon thing, the people I saw whose faces were just slightly off. I had a mother-freaking flip phone, and, again, not even a razor. As that thought left me, my pocket buzzed. Stupid phone. I flipped it open, again feeling a little cool, I had to admit. It was satisfying to gracefully flip open the first cell phone to take a phone call. Even better was slamming them shut after a phone call. You can't hang up the phone like you used to. It turned out it was a text message. I read it slowly. The blocky characters were from the other time, figuratively and quite literally. Don't go back to the room. I can't see how that's a good thing. This isn't even my phone. This isn't my time. What is all this? I froze for what seemed like a lifetime. I had a single thought. Text back. So I did. I struggled with the old way for a moment, forgetting how to use the text buttons. Ah yes, the world where keyboards were not shrunk down to a 4-inch dimension. If you wanted to text the letter S in any word, you had to hit the number 7 like 24 times. It made it simple, as my mind was already melting down the back of my spine. Who is this? I pecked. Your wife. We won't make. My skin went cold. I think it turned blue. Won't make what? I keyed the door open again, stumbling into the main room. She was gone. The bed was made, this time with a yellow comforter, set to look right out of the Brady Bunch. Okay, now it's panic time. I texted back furiously. I called, which didn't work at all. Didn't even get a busy signal or a dial tone. Getting seriously worried and hyperventilating, I dropped my phone. When I went to pick it up, I heard a voice. Hey kid, you okay? Kid. When I finally grabbed my phone, I pulled my arm back like I just stuck it in a campfire. My arm was small, like a child's. At that moment, I looked up at the voice I heard. I looked up. I wasn't an adult. The old woman that asked me was towering over me. Feeling sick again, I stumbled backwards, tripping over my feet over and over again. It was like that meme from the internet, when the internet was around, where people just kept falling down the escalator. When I finally gained my footing, I slammed into a newspaper machine. I don't know what else to call it. You used to put quarters in, and you would pull a newspaper thing out that told you the day's date and the news from last night. The Uncanny Valley Times, May of no year. The slogan, bringing you the most trusted news, just a bit off. What could that mean? Buzz. I remember when playing behind my house was an endless exploration of imaginative adventures that could only further inspire my 8-year-old mind. Many times I was a barbarian warrior, like Conan, lopping off hands with my enchanted tree branch. The evil beasts conjured up in my mind stood no chance against my strength and wit, my lust for action and romantic adventure. However, I now realized just how close my world was to intertwining with the Sumerian, his fiction. For many years, the tales of sword and sorcery described monsters of unfathomable terror. Oh, such only brute force and unwavering mind of a fearless warrior could encounter and hope to defeat them. I was not this warrior, yet my discovery of a hidden terror seemed to be destined for me to find. For when I wandered off the set path which led from mine to my grandparents' house, I stumbled across a shaded patch of forest with a small, murky pond at its center. The area was dead quiet, save for the crunching of dead leaves beneath my feet and the occasional nerve-wracking pop of breaking twigs. I remember a slight fog over the water, more like a vapor dissipating, as if the pond was boiling. Yet, being an ignorant youth, I reached down and touched the surface and felt it was very cold, so much so that I drew my hand back in surprise, only to begin violently wiping my fingers on my clothes, for the liquid was like some sort of sticky alcohol. With the commotion I made, I heard across the water a soft rustling that seemed to be heading around the pond in my direction, but I stopped once I glanced towards it. For all my fear of the sound, my eyes suddenly came across a shape in the center of the pond. It was like a pale, smooth limestone, yet from it came a small, delicate trail of bubbles, escaping from an unseen pocket of air. Stupidly, I started to lean forward, squinting for a better look. I fell, my body submerging in the cold burning of the foggy liquid. I desperately tried to place my feet on whatever ground I could find, but there was none. I kicked and thrashed towards the surface, not wanting to open my eyes for fear of the liquid blinding me. Suddenly, I felt one of my feet strike something hard. The limestone, maybe? But in response, there came a sound, a low grunt of some kind. The pond began to build up a slight current, and, as if returning the favor, a sharp pain hit my thigh. I screamed into the mysterious water, and put all of my effort into reaching the shore of what now seemed to be an infinite ocean. I was no longer Conan as I breached the surface. I was a child crying out for his parents, smothering from the fumes of this potentially poisonous body of a creature-infested water. I climbed out after what seemed an eternity of an unwaking nightmare, and refused to look back as I ran from the pond. I expected to hear the sound of a monster breaching the pond's surface, but the silence of the dark woods remained unbroken. The vapors of the dry liquid trailed behind me as I desperately made for the familiar path. When it was in sight, I felt the calmness of familiarity, which caused me to slow my pace. The world was luminous with the summer evening, and the creatures of common knowledge went about their business, ignorant of what I had found. When I reached home, I wondered if I had only dreamed up another fantastic story in which I had encountered the pond. There was no scent of the strange water, no more burning on my skin, but the fear in my heart returned as I looked down at my torn jeans and spied a coagulation of blood from a long scratch on my flesh. I hurried inside and tossed my clothes into the hamper, showering for good measure, unintentionally earning praise from my mother for being on top of my hygiene. I told my parents nothing about the pond or the scratch, but I couldn't completely hide my fearful glances to the window facing the edge of the forest during dinner. The question didn't come. All was normal within our house, which made me more and more at ease, as well as conscious of my illogical perception. The evening went on with my dad and I watching reruns of Star Trek, while my mom read one of her awful Amish-based novels in the lamplight. I look back on this time to comfort myself, given what was to follow. I was tucked into bed by my loving parents. Being an only child at the time, I was coddled quite a bit. The bedroom was alight with glow and dark stars, posters of Star Wars, shelves of action figures ready to defend me while I slumbered. The light of my aquarium and the shadow of the angelfish gliding on the wall eased me into a near doze, until the bubbles from the pump caused me to open my eyes in fear. Suddenly, as if responding to my fearful pondering, I heard a scratching in the vent near the right side of my bed. A soft clinking followed by breathing, as if something small was making a great effort to get through the grate. I was terrified. My hopes that my imagination from my playful excursions of the day had overtaken my senses were dashed. Yet the delusion refused to let loose its prisoner, which was my sanity. I knew I had to face it to prove its non-existence, so that logic could once again have dominion. "Hello?" I asked of the darkness. Immediately, the noise ceased, and in my mind's eye, I could see a rat scurrying away in fear of its discovery. But it was my contribution to this fable that was dismissed instead. "You found it, boy," came the whisper of a tiny creature behind the grate. My eyes welled with tears at the sound. I was about to call out to my parents when it continued. "All this time I tried to keep it hidden from the short nose, and a runt such as yourself seems compelled to find it and wake it up." The voice was irritated, yet it also contained a fear in its reverence. "What was it?" I asked, in a trembling voice. My aquarium bubbled quietly, reminding me of the pale shape in the pond. "It is a manticore, one that has hibernated for many human lifetimes, but has ended far more. I was entrusted to watch over it by the one who placed it in the prison. You stirred it. Now it will soon awaken." As I rose up in bed, I forgot my fear of disturbing circumstances and speaking with hidden things. I knew what a manticore was. I knew it well enough to have it far from my mind to dream up during my woodland adventures, for the image of the creature caused real fear in me, though in a hypothetical sense. The image I had seen in books of monsters went through my brain and disturbed me anew. Now I realized that I had been scratched by the thing's relentless claws. Had I opened my eyes while submerged in the pond, I knew that I would have gone mad to see the shape within the burning fog. "What can I do?" I asked. It didn't respond, yet I could still hear it breathing in the vent. "Please, I didn't mean to wake it up," I whimpered. I was trembling beneath the bed sheets, which used to make me feel safe. Now I only felt cold and alone, guilty for bringing such a thing into this world. "You cannot put it back to sleep. It's been too long now, and it'll be hungry. You cannot hurt it with any weapon, for its flesh is invulnerable. It can eat you whole, and it'll leave no bones behind. Its roar is terrible, boy. Your mother, your father, will wake up to the sound of it, and will be taken by madness once it enters your home. It will devour your neighbors, all who dwell nearby, and no one will know what's happened to any of you." I fell out of my bed and onto the floor, sobbing. I crawled to the vent and put my face down to it, without fear of what might happen. "What can I do?" I implored. "How can I kill it?" In the grate, I could see a tiny shape stirring within, 2 glimmers of silver light peering at me, and I could see the green flesh of a long, pointed nose. It was a goblin, small and mischievous looking, though at the moment the eyes looked sad and pitying. When it spoke for the final time, I sensed the want of a brighter circumstance. "If you wish to truly be the hero you pretend to be, you must slay it through its mouth." The eyes disappeared, and a soft, scrabbling shape faded into the darkness. I was alone with this frightening knowledge, and I had to make a choice. Should I return to my bed and risk waking up to the roar of the manticore, or did I face it that very night in the strange waters that it lay beneath? I was a child. I was scared, but I knew I couldn't let my family and my neighbors be devoured because of what I had done. I dressed, grabbed a flashlight and a small family picture propped up on the table next to my bed, then quietly went to the kitchen and grabbed the largest knife from the rack. With my weapon in hand, I went out the back door to the swaying trees of a windy midnight. I started up the path with an empty mind, neither allowing terrible imagery nor doubting logic to hinder my strides. I wasn't brave, but I wasn't foolish. I simply was. The reality, or at least my perception of it, had been shattered into shapeless pieces of mirror that, no matter how well formed, could never show my reflection in its former naivete. I prayed that I wouldn't find the pond, but I knew for sure that I would. The shape would be there. I would have to go back into the water and somehow open the mouth of the manticore and shove my feeble knife into it. This was my plight. I was 8 years old, on an adventure in my favorite place to pretend, and I could feel a laughing mockery of my innocence when I left the path once more. There was no sound but the wind and the trees. A crescent moon in a star-filled sky watched me from afar. I held my family picture to my chest and watched the hills of dead leaves. The beam of my flashlight shone through the trees, who almost seemed lonely in this path. In true This was a world left behind a long, long time ago, when fairies took flight, and in the gardens of elves, dryads danced for satyrs piping tunes. Whatever creatures flourished in this pocket of time so close to my home were long since devoured by the manticore. Likely whatever force imprisoned the beast also sent it here to our plane, as well as having the courtesy of leaving a goblin behind to watch over it, no doubt. I finally saw the pond reflecting its murky grayness with my flashlight, and my soul cried out within me as a cold fear enveloped my body. There were no more vapors floating on the surface. Neither was there a pale shape below. It was still and empty. The thoughts now began to race, both logical and fantastical. It was gone. It was never there. I can return to my warm bed and forget about it. It will be there waiting for me in the midst of my parents' innards. I wanted to scream for all the emotions, but it was the manticore that screamed into the night, sending a terrible jolt through my body. My bowels cramped at the sight of the giant face of a human hovering 10 feet in the air. The paws of an enormous lion's body thudded to the ground, the wings on its back flapping a gust that almost made me topple over. The barbed, porcupine-like tail flicked violently left to right, taking out a tree with one careless swipe. The eyes were large and bulging, yellow with black gashes for feline pupils. When my eyes met that of the monster's, it screamed again in satisfaction at its discovery of its first meal after so long its slumber. I could see its 3 rows of teeth as it howled at me, and yet somehow my only thought was, my parents are hearing this, and they're going to find out that I'm out of bed. They're going to look for me. They won't find me. I've been swallowed whole. When the manticore reached out to me, it stopped and gazed down at my tiny form and did something that finally snapped me out of my insane stupor. It grinned. The monster was grinning at my fear. The teeth were sharp and yellow. The stench of its breath broke through each of them and made me almost vomit. Stagnation of time, the willingness of its stomach acid to return to its labor. The manticore was ready to indulge itself. It breathed in through its nostrils, then opened its mouth and slowly came down over my head. Yet, somehow, instead of succumbing to terror, a white-hot hatred took over. I was offended at how weak it perceived me. I was irritated at how much of a bully this thing was. This freak of nature had thrown its weight around eons ago and eradicated the peaceful world in which I lived. I refused to let this happen again. Not to my family, my neighbors, and certainly not to me. I stepped on the first layer of its teeth and stabbed the knife into its tongue. It screamed and began to try to close its jaws on me, but I had already climbed further in and now sank my knife into the roof of its mouth. The beast thrashed its head, trying to sling me out, but I kept climbing further in, slicing and stabbing all the way through. I remember the barbarous man of action that I pretended to be, and I embraced it fully, burrowing deep into its throat, spitting blood from my own mouth as I climbed. By the sudden change in its equilibrium, I could tell it had fallen to the ground and was struggling against the pain. I pressed my feet against the back of its throat and shoved my knife deep into its skull. I couldn't penetrate it, so I began to cut upward as hard as I could. Its screams were deafening, but I knew that it could hear my laughter as I sliced and mangled without mercy. Suddenly, I was drowned in cold, burning water from the pond, along with fresh screaming, as it mingled with the manticore's wounds. I lost my knife in the flood, but not my footing, or the family picture in my hand. I kissed it, then smashed the glass in the frame and shoved it into the open gash as hard as I could. The monster bellowed and suddenly began to whine pitifully. The thrashing ceased, and the water flowed inside until I was completely submerged. I began to swim out of the mouth, fearful of the teeth, but desperate to get out. My eyes burned horridly, and all the vision I had darkened from the night, so I felt my way past the teeth to the surface. Through the burning, I could make out the flashlight, which lay on the ground, and I swam towards it, fearing the claws of the beast seizing me and pulling me under. Suddenly there were small hands grabbing my arms and helping me out of the pond. It was the goblin, though I could barely see its shape. "You did it, boy! You did it! You slew the manticore!" I was confused. All the effort I put forth to hurt the creature still hadn't been enough to kill it. The goblin continued to bellow his claim, and I expected any moment that the thing would come back up and chomp us both. Yet the creature was silent. I could see now that it had plunged head first into the pond and drowned itself. It's really dead?" I asked. "Poisoned. The water is deadly to manticores that ingest it, which is why it was put here to sleep. But they can hold their breath for a long time. You made it drink the water to relieve the torture, and now its innards will burn away." I fell back and watched the star-filled sky. A meteor passed, and with it went my wish to always have this bravery that overcame my impossible fear. As the years progressed in my life, I found myself abandoning my imagination, my thoughts of heroism, but I always remembered the moment when I accepted my new reality at the edge of the pond.